Welcome to Sab's podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Omar Baddar. He is a political analyst, a digital producer, and a human rights advocate. Omar, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sabrina, for having me on.
So, Omar, I have seen you in a number of spaces. I've seen you on Breakthrough News. I've also seen you recently on CNN advocating for the Palestinian people. And I'm very curious, why did you decide to become a human rights advocate to begin with?
Yeah, look, when you grow up Palestinian, the issue of just the scale of the injustice that Palestinians are going through, it's very difficult to kind of go on with normal life and ignore that. I was fairly apolitical early on, but when I moved to the United States in my teenage years, the second Palestinian uprising, the second Intifada had broken out when I was in college, and the images coming out from Palestine were absolutely infuriating. And more infuriating was the way that people were talking about it here in the United States, what media coverage was like, just the insane bias and the blind spots in the narrative that the Palestinian story is completely missing. You had a complete reversal of oppressor and oppressed in that dynamic. And I just felt absolutely compelled, given specifically the fact that we live in the United States, the government that is arming and funding the Israeli government, to give a more accurate picture of what's unfolding to the American people, which I thought is a way to influence American foreign policy in a direction where it might be more just and even-handed. But obviously that has proven to be an extremely tall order and an uphill battle until today.
Do you feel like since October 7th, more Americans now understand what the Palestinian people have been dealing with, particularly in Israel? Because I do feel like prior to October 7th, when I was talking about Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, I felt like a lot of Americans just really didn't understand or had no idea that Palestinians were even occupied in Gaza. A lot of people that I spoke to didn't even know what Gaza was. Do you feel like since October 7th, given a lot of the protests that have happened across the world, that is starting to change?
Yeah, it has changed a lot, but there's a clear generational divide, and it all has to do with how people consume information. For people who are, just younger people, tend to access information through social media. They follow podcasts like yours, they follow YouTube. This is where they're getting their information. And there is a freer flow of information and clear images that are coming out of Palestine that are impossible to deny. And through that, you can't help but want to be educated about what is actually unfolding, because the reality on the ground is not reflected at all in the way that our political discourse engages with it. And that's a sharp contrast with an older generation of Americans that still rely on mainstream legacy media to understand this issue. And I think there still remains a very deep misconception of what is unfolding in Palestine. To the extent that things have improved in mainstream coverage, there is some humanization of Palestinians. There's an understanding that there is significant Palestinian suffering. But what's missing is an analysis of why that is and what's fundamentally wrong. So even though you will turn on CNN and MSNBC and other mainstream outlets and see that Palestinians are suffering and dying and the conditions in Gaza are terrible, you're not going to find much conversation about the fact that Israel is an apartheid regime that has imposed a system of brutal occupation on top of Palestinians for many, many decades, and that Israel denying Palestinians their most fundamental human rights is the reason we're actually stuck in the situation that we're in now. That piece of analysis is missing, and I think it's deeply frustrating. But there's a very clear generational divide on this issue, and it's in a way, as depressing as American policy is, and as mainstream coverage currently remains, there is a promising sign in the fact that younger generations have a much, much better understanding of this issue, and things are going to improve over time in this country and hopefully with its policy at some point.
Let's continue with the apartheid situation. From what I understand, in particular in the West Bank, I've spoken to a couple of people on this show that have been to the West Bank, and they told me that they were very surprised that there's certain roads that Palestinians cannot take, that you have to have a passport, I guess, to go to certain areas, and really, really upsetting. It does remind me of some of the stories that I heard about apartheid South Africa. When we think about the West Bank, and I want to talk about this area first because I do feel like people are kind of forgetting about that because of what's happening in Gaza. we're looking at possibly one of the biggest land grabs in Israel. This was reported recently that Israel wants to go ahead and annex the West Bank because of the fact that some of the other countries have decided to acknowledge that there is a Palestinian state or to have a Palestinian state. So this is their way of punishing the Palestinian people, starting with the apartheid. Can you describe some of the conditions that are happening in the West Bank for people who are Palestinian?
Sure. And just to set up a little bit more context for your audience, it's really important to note that the West Bank is not a part of Israel as recognized by the United Nations. The West Bank is occupied Palestinian territory. Israel took it over in 1967, and immediately the UN issued a resolution 242 saying that you cannot acquire territory by force. That's a standard principle of international law, that you can't just go take over other people's countries, and said that Israel is obligated to end that occupation, that they have to withdraw from the occupied territories. So that, I think, is a really, I mean, just whenever, again, you look at what mainstream coverage is, when you leave out that part of the story, it's easy to understand why people would have a complete and total misunderstanding. It's not Israel, and yet Israel has ruled it for many, many decades. There's an international consensus about the fact that the West Bank does not belong to Israel. And that has not stopped Israel from taking full control of the West Bank. And effectively, what they've been doing for a long period of time is annexing the West Bank on the ground. They've been doing it very, very slowly. It's ethnic cleansing in slow motion, where they keep squeezing Palestinians into smaller and smaller areas of the West Bank and inviting Israeli citizens to become settlers in the West Bank. And so those settlements are expanding. This is all in complete contravention to international law. There's no dispute about that among anybody who knows anything about international law. And across, the international community, the UN General Assembly takes a vote virtually on an annual basis on the question of Palestine, and there is a complete consensus on this issue. The International Court of Justice also issued an advisory opinion in 2004 explaining that the settlements are illegal and that Israel's they're building a wall throughout the West Bank in order to protect Israelis from Palestinians, that this is effectively an apartheid wall. It's a wall of segregation and a land grab. And that situation has continued every single day since the day that Israel occupied the West Bank back in the 1960s. And what is happening now is that in reaction to people criticizing Israeli policy or beginning to have more diplomatic relations with Palestinians or recognizing Palestinians' right to a state, Israel is, quote unquote, punishing that recognition by accelerating its takeover of the Palestinian territories. That is effectively what is happening. And it's not as if Israel was not doing that before that recognition came. All that has changed is the rate at which they are capturing those areas. And we're having this pretense, we're playing this game as if Israel is not officially trying to take those areas over and make them part of Israel. But policy on the ground, you can't miss it. I mean, for anybody who has visited the West Bank, it's very, very clear. There are areas that are closed off. Palestinians can't visit them. There are roads, and it matters what license plate you have. If you're a Palestinian citizen in the West Bank, your license plate is green and white. But if you're an Israeli settler, then your license plate is yellow. It's the same as those of regular Israelis living within Israel as recognized by the international community. And you drive on different roads. And when you come up to a checkpoint, people with a yellow license plate can pretty much cruise through, and people with a white and yellow license plate have to pull over to the side and have their car searched. I mean, it is really Jim Crow. It is extremely blatant. And you have situations in which a Palestinian walking down the street inside the heart of a Palestinian city like Hebron, being stopped by an Israeli soldier and asked, "Are you Jewish?" And when they say, "No, I'm not," they say, "Okay, well, you can't walk here. You have to go find a different route." This stuff is on video. It's there in plain sight for anybody who wants to look at it. But again, if you're watching mainstream American media, you would know nothing about Israeli apartheid. And that's what's incredibly upsetting and disheartening. And it's part of the reason why the United States gets away with this horrific policy of empowering and arming occupiers and invaders who are practicing apartheid, and in this case, in Gaza, genocide at this point. And I will talk about that in a little bit more. And Americans put up with it because they don't have a deep enough understanding of it. That is beginning to change. But believe me, if we accurately describe the situation to a broad American audience and held politicians' feet to the fire and held them accountable to answer for the policies that they are pushing, you would see that policy change in a heartbeat, because the injustice of it is just so incredibly glaring.
That's correct. And I think another thing, too, when I think about the West Bank, the settlements are illegal. as acknowledged by the UN. But do you feel that the UN is effective? And I ask that question because sometimes I feel like the UN just writes a strongly worded letter, but then I'm looking for the action that comes after that. Who's going to stop Israel from, building those illegal settlements? Who's going to stop them from kicking Palestinian people out of their home? I've seen video footage of settlers sitting outside of Palestinian families' homes, waiting for them to leave to go to work so that they can take it over. Like, who is going to actually implement any type of action here? Do you feel that they are effective, and why or why not?
Yeah, I mean, look, the videos you're describing, also they're a dime a dozen, they're everywhere. And it's infuriating because quite often settlers do that under the cover of Israeli authorities who are present with their guns and do nothing to stop them. If anything, they're there to protect the settlers stealing Palestinian homes from the Palestinian families whose homes are being taken away. They're there to provide protection for land theft and the theft of homes. And the UN is structurally disappointing because when it was formed, obviously, the great powers did not want things to get out of hand. A country like the United States does not want to be beholden to international law in any meaningful sense. That's why they're not, the United States and Israel don't subscribe to the International Criminal Court. They don't want to be held accountable for any crimes that our officials or their officials commit. And then you have the mechanism by which the UN can act. That can only happen through the Security Council. And that is the council where the United States has a veto. And anytime the UN gets together and decides to take some kind of action to hold Israel accountable, the US steps in and vetoes that resolution. This has happened more than 50 times over the past few decades. And Sabrina, just to put that in perspective, the number of times the US used its veto to protect Israel is greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all the other permanent members of the Security Council combined on all issues for that same period from the 1970s until today. So it's at this point, it's almost a joke, the idea that you can hold Israel accountable through the UN, because the US has made a mockery out of international law and out of the UN Security Council by just repeatedly defending Israel and vetoing resolutions that are critical of Israel. And those are things, what makes it more infuriating is that the US vetoes resolution that in principle, in fact, go along with American policy. American policy, with the exception of Donald Trump, is to say that settlements are illegal and that they're not legitimate. And yet, when the UN votes to declare those settlements illegal, then the US steps in and vetoes a resolution that in principle is supposed to go along with what American policy is. So it just tells you that the entire way that the United States treats the world, the whole thing is just a charade. We say what we need to say to sound good on paper, talking about, especially with the Biden administration, about the centrality of restoring decency and centering human rights in American foreign policy, and it's about promoting democracy. All this lofty rhetoric is just so brazenly contradicted in American action, and nowhere is it more blatant than it is in Palestine and Israel. This is a stain on America's conscience, and it's the most blatant demonstration of injustice that we see in American foreign policy. Sabrina, we try to pretend sometimes that when you think of America's history with the genocide and ethnic cleansing of the natives, when you talk about slavery, when you talk about Jim Crow, that those are things that are supposed to be in our long gone history, things that we're ashamed of, things that we've learned from. And surely if something like that were to happen today, we would do the right thing. Except here you have an example in American foreign policy where you are supporting those policies externally. We're helping a foreign country do exactly what we pretend we would never put up with at this point. And that just tells you something about where we are. And it's ought to be a moment of reckoning for the United States, and only Americans rising up and demanding that accountability can bring it about.
Why do you feel the US continues to protect Israel, even though some of their Western allies have spoken out against Israel? I know there was a statement from Norway. There was also a statement from Spain. Why do you feel the US is still protecting Israel?
Look, there's two factors here. One, there are the ways in which Israel is useful to US empire. And so there is a strategic interest, in a sense, in being allied with a really powerful country in the region. And you see that demonstrated with the way US military funding for Israel happened. Israel was a very, very tiny recipient of US military funding at the beginning. But after the Six-Day War in 1967, where they did occupy the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights in Syria, and the Sinai Desert in Egypt, all within a span of 6 days, the US looked at Israel and thought, this is a really powerful and effective military force. dominating the Middle East is really important because of oil resources and energy resources. And so being allies with a really powerful country is a good step. And that's when you saw US military funding for Israel increase by 100-fold within a very, very short period of time then. But beyond that, there are moments in which Israeli behavior and actions clearly undermine US interests. The US gains nothing from settlement expansion in the West Bank. They gain nothing from the indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza. Those are things that actually harm the United States, harm US standing in the world, harm US credibility when we talk about human rights, when we criticize what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So the question then becomes, why does the US put up with these specific aspects of Israeli behavior? And this is where the Israel lobby is a very, very significant factor, and there's no denying it. Groups like AIPAC spend millions and millions of dollars, and they're quite open about the fact that they are there to bully politicians who are critical of Israel by funding their opponents, and they are there to fund politicians who are supportive of Israel as a means of maintaining that pressure on our political class to be supportive of Israel at all times. And they're not shy about bragging about it. There is a case from a couple of decades ago when a senior AIPAC official was talking to Jeffrey Goldberg, who's a pro-Israel journalist at The Atlantic now. And they were just kind of talking about the influence of AIPAC, and the senior AIPAC official grabbed an empty piece of napkin off the table and said, this piece of napkin, within 24 hours, I can get the signatures of 70 US senators on it. Bragging about the fact that it didn't matter what they wanted something to be signed off on, that if simply they leverage their power in Congress, they can get Congress to fold and do what they want. And that has long been a really destructive force in American politics. Now, I don't want to single out the Israel lobby. There are many lobbies that have destructive influence. When you think about the gun lobby and the oil lobby, and there's so many special interests in America that undermine the normal democratic process in the United States. These are interests where you look at American public opinion, it's on one side, but then you look at how politicians are voting, it's in the other side, and you think, well, we're a democracy. Why aren't politicians representing the will of the American people? And the answer almost always is special interests with deep pockets come in and influence things in a different direction. You see it with the pharmaceutical industry, with the prices of medications, with the way that we allow that industry to basically constantly raise the price of medications on Americans when Americans have actually funded the development of these medications through public money. So this is a much deeper problem in American politics, but certainly in the realm of foreign policy, no lobby comes anywhere close to the influence that AIPAC has. They certainly are, in terms of tilting American foreign policy in a direction that does not serve American interests. I think the Israel lobby is the most influential when it comes to these forces.
They have even managed to capture Black politicians and Afro-Latino politicians like Richie Torres to be pro-Israel and Israel first, to go to different speaking events to advocate for Israel before even advocating for African Americans here in the United States. It's really disturbing to me when I see that they are willing to basically go against another group of people that are being oppressed, the Palestinian people, even though you're from a group of people that is oppressed and that has gone through segregation and all of these different issues here in the United States. And that just goes to show you just how easily these politicians can be captured. There was a story a while back. It was from Rick Sterling. He had talked a lot about JFK. And one of the things that was revealed in the JFK documents is that JFK actually was afraid that AIPAC, back then it was a different name, I forget, but that it would gain too much power. He was also concerned about the fact of Israel having nuclear weapons. He did not approve of that. And for people who are not aware, before he was supposed to go visit Israel, right before that, that was when JFK was killed. So I wonder how things would have been if JFK would have stayed alive. And I wonder if AIPAC would have gained as much power as it did.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when you look at the trend of how things have happened over time, it's not just you don't have to go that far back. We have a situation in the United States where you have a deteriorating relationship between the Israel lobby and the US government. Back when Israel invaded Lebanon in the 1980s, it was none other than Ronald Reagan who picked up the phone and told the Israelis they had to withdraw immediately. that the bombing is horrific. It was causing too many civilian casualties. I think he may have compared it to the Holocaust even, and said that you have to bring it to an end. And Israel folded. They actually brought it to an end immediately. When George H.W. Bush was frustrated with the fact that Israel kept building settlements and disregarding American objections to them, they withheld loan guarantees for Israel and said, when you become serious about making peace, give us a call and we'll talk. You had some level of tough talk between American presidents and Israel in the past that now seems to be non-existent. It's just like it's been on a slide this entire time, where as time goes on, somehow our government's backbone keeps disappearing and becoming more reluctant and more unable to stand up to Israel and say that they have to do things differently. And we're in a moment right now where American public opinion has shifted in a very positive direction at the same time that the American political establishment is becoming worse and worse on this topic. And it just simply doesn't make any sense. Those things should not be going in opposite directions. That if our politicians were concerned about doing what is popular and what might get them elected and what could get them votes, the Democratic base at this point is very clear about the fact that they oppose, not just even before the current genocide in Gaza, they thought that the US should restrict military funding for Israel because of Israel's violation of Palestinian human rights. And that just continues growing. And at this point, the majority of Biden's base describe Israel's policy in Gaza as a genocide. And so we need to have a politics that is more responsive of what Americans want, and that shares the moral clarity that Americans do have when they have the facts at their fingertips, and be more responsive to it. And just the trend has been really pathetic. And we're at a point right now where, because the Republicans want to make this a wedge issue, they see Democratic public opinion turning on Israel in the masses. They're trying to use that to try to paint Democratic politicians as anti-Israel. So you might remember that President Obama gave Israel more military funding than any other president that came before him, but that did not stop the Republicans from saying that Obama is anti-Israel and implying that he's anti-Semitic and too sympathetic to Palestinians, completely divorced from reality, because Obama was in fact very pro-Israel in his actions. And yet that immediately causes Democrats to tremble and to run and say, no, 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 we're pro-Israel. What are you talking about? And then they start performing effectively to try to show that they are really supportive of Israel. The one break from that we've had during the Obama administration was literally in the last month of Obama's presidency, when he was leaving office and it was all over with, where the UN voted that Israeli settlements are illegal, that Israel has to stop them, and talking about accountability for companies that fund those, that basically do business with these settlements. That's a resolution that Obama allowed to pass. He didn't vote for it, but he abstained from using the American veto. He just sat that vote out. And virtually every Republican, and so many Democrats as well, started talking about this great betrayal of Israel that Obama had performed, when all Obama had done is simply sit back and allow a vote to happen about Israel's land theft that he did not weigh in on. And it tells you something about their mentality, that sitting it out is not good enough. The correct moral thing for Obama to do is to go a step further, to vote for that resolution saying those settlements are illegal, and saying that the US is going to hold Israel accountable if they continue doing that. That's what the moral position. And yet Obama abdicated that moral responsibility and sat back and just decided to sit it out. And yet those folks demand so much unquestionable loyalty for everything that Israel does that they started talking about how Obama betrayed Israel and how he threw Israel under the bus. It's just, it's completely bonkers. We don't have a sane politics when it comes to American policy on Israel.
That's correct. I'm curious, Omar, how did you feel when all the students started to start the encampments at the college campuses? How did you feel when thousands of people got out into the streets, and people were still protesting, but I mean, immediately, like after October 7th, to see thousands of people out in the streets protesting against this genocide? How did you feel?
Yeah, it's honestly incredible. And frankly, I did not expect it. I mean, I knew that there would be some people who are upset by it. I imagined it would be niche, it would be small, it would be some people who are really well informed. But watching it catch like wildfire across campuses throughout the entire country, to me, was a very, very heartwarming and empowering moment. In a way, it's a visual representation of the promise of where this country is heading and the fact that the future is going to be better than the past. It's yeah, and in the face of so much repression, in the face of laws that are trying to conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel, in which these students now really risk having anti-Semitism and effectively racial harassment complaints brought against them for the crime of standing up for Palestinian rights. and some students are getting expelled. In the face of all that, the fact that they're still standing up and demanding justice and refusing to bow down to this current policy, it's just, I mean, you have to applaud their bravery. It really is incredible what is unfolding on college campuses. And I see it as a very, very promising sign of the fact that, you know, young people are going to hold our politicians' feet to the fire, and they are going to change policy for the better.
I agree. And that brings me over to Gaza. One of the things that I noticed before October 7th, it was very clear to me how the Palestinian people were treated in Gaza. So to me, the first thing that I discovered was that they could not move freely. So that in itself was an alarm to me. Israel controlled the water, the air, all the resources. They were able to allow what foods could go into Gaza, which was really bizarre to me. The water, most of the water that the Palestinians received in Gaza was dirty water. It's a very densely populated area. So obviously, they had limited amounts of electricity. This is all before October 7th, and I had issues with that. Since October 7th, of course, the situation is even more dire. People are on the brink of starvation, regardless of what the State Department tries to say about how they're giving them food. Based on the videos that I've seen, people are on the brink of starvation. Israel has been moving Palestinian people in Gaza from one camp to another camp, telling them you have to leave, you have to go there. And then they go to different refugee camps, and those camps are still bombed as a result. And then there is this immense amount of pressure on Egypt because Egypt is not opening their border to allow them to come in. At the same time, I understand that Egypt also has refugees, and they basically said that they couldn't afford to take in, more refugees. But regardless, I also think that Egypt knows what Israel's trying to do, that Israel's trying to cleanse the land. And once the Palestinian people, if they were to go into Egypt, they would not be allowed to come back to Gaza, in my opinion. What do you think Israel wants to do with that land?
Yeah, I mean, everything that you've said is spot on. Getting into Egypt's motivation, that can be a whole other can of worms. But just to describe what the situation was before October 7th, I think is really important to understand October 7th itself as well. It's a situation in which, exactly as you described, Palestinians were effectively a captive population in Gaza. It was a cage. It was an open air prison. That's what a concentration camp. That's what Gaza was. Palestinians are not allowed to go in and out. 2 million of them who lived in Gaza, half of whom are children. Israel bombed the airport in Gaza. They're not allowed to rebuild it because Israel does not allow Palestinians to have an airport. They're not allowed to have a seaport. They're not allowed to travel. They're not allowed to see anything that is not Gaza. They sometimes, in rare exceptions, they don't have medical equipment to deal with all kinds of diseases in Gaza. Israel does not allow them to have cancer treatment equipment in Gaza because they are worried about so-called dual use. You have a situation of complete domination of one group over another, in which Palestinians are just dehumanized. And from Israel's perspective, that's an acceptable status quo. And it's only an acceptable status quo if you see Palestinians as less than human. And whenever Palestinians would fight back in any way, Israel would just unleash the full might of its military, and they would massacre thousands of people in Gaza, again, before October 7th. In one episode in 2014, Israel bombed Gaza, killing 2,200 Palestinians, including more than 550 Palestinian children. And at the time, that was an unprecedented attack in its scale. And it is only compared to the current genocide does that number seem small by comparison. But that was the situation in Gaza. No jobs, no prospect for a better future. A fundamental part of human nature is wanting to make sure that your kids are going to be good, maybe have a better life than you did. That was not an option in Gaza. There was nothing but despair. And born out of that oppression and despair is naturally extremism on some level, people who want to fight back by any means possible. And so Israeli policy towards Gaza is absolutely what laid the groundwork over a long period of time for a kind of explosion like what we saw on October 7th happen. It would be insane. People constantly talk about the failure of Israeli intelligence. Did they not see October 7th coming, or did they? And mixed information about how ready they should have been for it. From my perspective, there's a more fundamental failure of common sense. The idea that you can put 2 million people in a cage for years and years and years and not expect that there's going to be a reaction of some kind, that people are not going to figure out a way to burst out of that with vengeance, I think is completely and totally insane. And people who are interested in solving problems would be looking at the underlying causes, and the underlying cause here is unquestionably the fact that Israel treated Palestinians like they're not human beings and denied them all of their rights. And so here we are, October 7th happens, Israel retaliates and is now carrying out genocide on full blast. And what they want to do is really, to use Netanyahu's words, quote what he said when he was speaking to one of his advisors privately, we need to thin the population of Gaza down to a minimum. That's what he said. And it's their way of saying we would like to just completely get rid of Palestinians in Gaza. That's honestly a more fundamental part of Israeli policy in general, is that they want to get rid of Palestinians, period. They even talk about it with Palestinian citizens of Israel who are living within 48 Palestine, what is today legally recognized by the UN as Israel. They're obviously doing it in the West Bank in slow motion, and they would like to do it in Gaza as well. And that is what they're carrying out at this point. They're trying to thin the population down to a minimum through indiscriminate bombing, through a campaign of mass starvation that has already killed dozens of people, including dozens of children. That is what they're doing. They're committing an absolutely horrific crime right before our eyes under the pretense that they're only fighting Hamas. But every major human rights organization that is documenting Israeli behavior has made absolutely clear that Israel is not engaging in pinpointed targeting of militants, that they are engaging in indiscriminate bombing. When you look at the sheer amount of destruction throughout Gaza, when you look at the targeting of the so-called safe zones, as you mentioned, when they tell Palestinians to flee to a specific area that's supposed to be a safe zone, then they drop massive 2,000-pound bombs on those safe zones. 2,000-pound bombs are inherently indiscriminate. They're called dumb bombs because they just cause massive destruction, and you can't target anyone with them. And you have stuff being revealed in the Israeli press, policies of, using AI to generate arbitrarily endless targets in Gaza so they can keep bombing them while pretending that this is a way to go after Hamas. The fact that they have bombed large residential buildings without warning anybody on the inside that they're about to do that as part of what they call power targets to intimidate the population. They are trying to erase Palestinian existence in Gaza. They don't know whether they're going to be fully successful or not, but they're trying to do it to the maximum extent that they can. And what I worry is that they are hoping, you have an extremely horrific policy with Biden allowing all of this to happen, indulging it and arming it. And what I worry is that Netanyahu might be waiting for the possibility of Trump taking power so that what they're currently playing around with and dancing around can just be explicit and open Israeli policy. Because we know that Jared Kushner has already talked about how Palestinians should not be allowed to return to North Gaza, how all of that beach property is wonderful and Israel should take it over. So this official ethnic cleansing that Israel is effectively carrying out, that Biden is only rhetorically objecting to, when you hear Kamala Harris or Joe Biden talk, they say, we don't want the reoccupation of Gaza, we don't want this, we don't want that. But the policy is to allow it to happen. If Trump comes along and Netanyahu declares that their goal is officially to reoccupy Gaza and ethnically can cleanse Palestinians out of it, Trump might in fact endorse it. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place right now. The idea that we live in a country in which those are the choices that we have, the existing sitting president is arming and funding genocide, and the one that wants to take the presidency away from him is promising to make it even worse, is just, it really is difficult to find the words for it. It's an incredibly disheartening situation that we're in right now, and it's, hard to know what we're supposed to do at this point.
Do you think that some of the uncommitted voters, so there's the Uncommitted Campaign that's happening all across the country now. It started in Dearborn, Michigan. Do you think that some of the Muslim uncommitted voters would be willing to support one of the third party or independent candidates that is correct on this issue? So there's Jill Stein, there's Dr. Cornel West, and I'm excluding RFK Jr. because he's not correct on this issue either. He's a Zionist.
The worst of them all, actually, in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's above and beyond. Yep. But do you think that any of those voters would be willing to support one of those candidates?
I'm sure. I have no doubt that there's going to be a significant, pull away from Biden towards some of these nominees. Just both of them, right? Cornel West and Jill Stein are very good on this particular issue. Better than the overwhelming majority of anybody who's ever run for president in the United States on any of that stuff. So there's going to be that is going to be a factor. I think another factor is going to be people who are just afraid of Trump and are, at the end of the day, might just vote for Biden and hold their noses in spite of how horrified they are with what Biden has done. And then there might be people who are still sitting out to see what Biden does between now and the election. I don't think there's zero chance that Biden regains all of the, Arab American and American Muslim vote. That's gone. That's done. There's no way he's going to recapture all of it. But the question is, between now and the election, can he do more than he has done to bring some of them back over? The Uncommitted Campaign was calling for an arms embargo of Israel. And I can imagine that at this point, even though Biden has enabled a horrific policy that has turned a lot of people off, if he were to come out now and say, okay, enough is enough, Israel has to stop this, and if you don't, we're cutting off the weapons supply, that might be, in fact, a way to regain some of the popularity that he has lost with some of those voters. But again, I think the Uncommitted Campaign has already been successful in changing the way that Biden talks about this issue. He used to talk about it exclusively in terms of Israel's right to defend itself and supporting Israel and so on. And I think Uncommitted, showing the power that they did have and the numbers of people that they're able, to hold in the balance and really potentially decide whether Joe Biden can be president again or not, has caused Biden to backtrack, to start complaining about Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian civilians, about how too many civilians are being killed, and about how Israel should do more, and maybe withholding some weapons for a week and then not releasing them until the week after. Again, nowhere near where he should be. It's not enough. But you can tell he's struggling with it, and he's struggling with it because those voters have made their voices heard. So I think it definitely has had an impact. And there's no question the fact that what Biden has done so far is going to lead to significant voting blocks, either sitting home entirely or actually turning out for third-party candidates. So we'll see how the rest of young people in America end up weighing in once the election comes up.
I've seen this video go around multiple times of Benjamin Netanyahu at a conference where he has a map in his hand and he's showing people his idea of a greater Israel. And it's very clear that they don't just want Gaza and the West Bank. There was also parts of like southern Lebanon that was in that picture as well. The line that he was drawing,
Yeah. The
expanding
Syrian Golan
this.
Heights primarily. That's a huge part that Israel captured from Syria. And again, international consensus, this is occupied territory, Israel has to give it back. And then Trump came along and said, we recognize Israeli sovereignty in the Golan Heights. And what's really shameful here is that when Biden came along, he did not say, we're undoing Trump's policy. He just remained silent on it. And his administration has sort of been coy when they've been put on the spot, asked about it. They would respond by saying, US policy has not changed. And this way, they're leaving it open to interpretation. People who want to consider the Golan Heights Israeli territory can take that to mean that US policy from the Trump days to now has not changed, or people who would like to have a different interpretation of it, saying that the US has always considered this to be illegally occupied territory. The US policy has not changed from that. They've never bothered to clarify. They've been deliberately vague to try to have everybody interpret it in the way that makes them happy as a way of gaining support across the spectrum. But again, the morally correct thing to do here and the legally correct thing to do here, and what serves America's standing in the world and the international institutions that we claim to want to prop up and support, what Biden should have said is come out and say, the Golan Heights are occupied Syrian territory and that occupation has to end. That is a basic fundamental principle of international law. And Biden has not done that. He's just been a disappointment in one way after the other on this issue.
I agree with you there. Why haven't some of the other countries, just to get your perspective, Jordan, the UAE, we're going to pass on Saudi Arabia because I know that they have a tight sort of relationship with the US. They're also part of BRICS too. But Jordan and the UAE, the Queen of Jordan is Palestinian. Why aren't they speaking out against Israel?
Look, with some of these countries, it's funny. First, let me say that for all the countries in the region, and frankly, including Saudi Arabia, if those countries were democracies, every last one of them would cut off relations with Israel because of the way Israel treats Palestinians. That is the popular sentiment in the region. People don't want normalization with Israel as long as Israel treats Palestinians the way it does, as long as it denies them their most basic rights and imposes an occupation on them and treats them like just this indiscriminate bombing of Palestinian areas and the land theft. This does not sit well with anybody in the region. Now, you have a situation in which in Jordan, the majority of the population is effectively Palestinian. They were Palestinians that Israel ethnically cleansed and ended up in Jordan, and Jordan gave them citizenship, unlike some other countries where Palestinian refugees had come. And you do have a situation in which what Jordan thinks, including the government, is that what Israel is doing in Gaza is horrible and has to come to an end. And yet, Jordan, the official government's relationship with the US is so tight, and they depend on the US for economic development, for security protection. They have intelligence collaboration, that in order to remain on the US team and remain on good terms with the United States, they know that their criticism of Israel can only go so far. So they'll come out on TV and say, this is horrible, this has to stop, what Israel's doing is unacceptable, but they would never take meaningful action against it because they know that that might be a red line for the United States. And then if they're cut off from US support, that's a prospect that is scary for them. And that is the case with several countries in the region. Egypt, the Egyptian government is frankly the same way. They want the Gaza crisis to end because they don't want the prospect of Palestinian refugees ending up in Egypt. And yet, the Egyptian government is a major human rights abuser. It is a significant recipient of US military funding. And the reason why the US started giving them massive military funding is because they made this peace agreement with Israel back in the 70s. So effectively, the government in Egypt and Israel and the United States are on one team, and you have some tensions within that, but those tensions can only go so far, and they will never cross a particular line and a particular barrier. This is in contrast to countries that are completely outside of the US orbit. So when you talk about Iran, when you talk about Syria, when you talk about Lebanon, in which Hezbollah is a very dominant force, when you talk about Yemen, currently dominated by the Houthis, those are forces that are outside of the US orbit, and they are committed to a Middle East that is not dominated by the US and Israel. And so their policy is very, very different. And you can see that they've been very antagonistic towards Israel throughout all of this, especially in Hezbollah and Lebanon, sort of been having tit for tat over the border with Israeli military forces. There have been hundreds of casualties on both sides. It's kind of a silent war that we're not talking about enough. But if that gets out of hand, we're talking about completely reshaping the way the region looks, because Hezbollah is not Hamas. Hezbollah is infinitely more powerful, and a serious war between Israel and Hezbollah will have unprecedented consequences basically for the entire makeup of the region. But so far, neither Hezbollah nor Israel wants full-out war, because we have what is called in US strategic terminology, mutually assured destruction, MAD. They know that if that war gets out, that Israel can destroy Lebanon and that Hezbollah can destroy Israel as well, and they don't want it to reach that level. And so the tensions have been contained across the border, but they seem to be expanding very, very gradually, and the prospect of an open war between Lebanon and Israel is not completely off the table at this point.
One last question for you, Omar, and that's about Zionism. It's very clear to me a lot of people are pointing fingers at Netanyahu and his administration. But one of the things that I continue to tell my viewers is that if you remove Netanyahu, they'll just replace him with someone else that continues the same policies, because at the end of the day, I feel like the big criticism is Zionism. It is this supremacy, the supremacist ideology that is allowing people to feel that way. And it's just like when Netanyahu says, we have to go in and we have to root out Hamas, which is not happening apparently, obviously, but that's again is an ideology. So when I think of Hamas, this is why I get upset when I hear Piers Morgan say to many of his guests, but do you condemn Hamas? For me, that is difficult to hear, because you cannot capture people, you cannot occupy people and imprison them and expect these people not to, fight back at some point. And I feel like Israel has been a big bully on the playground, and they've been poking and hitting the Palestinian people. And so I felt like that's where Hamas, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that's where Hamas came from, as some type of, retaliation against that, to fight back against it. When I look at Zionism, if I'm looking at the history, it seems like since the very beginning, this was the plan, was to cleanse the land of the Palestinian people and for Israel to have the area just for the Israelis, because they're saying that's the Holy Land. But again, I feel like there's this supremacy that is being tied to religion, when at the end of the day, there are people who are Jewish, religiously Jewish, but they're not Zionist. So I feel like at the root of it, the Zionism is the big problem.
Yeah, look, I mean, just on the Hamas part specifically, I think you're absolutely correct. That is where Hamas came from. It's a fact that Hamas was born out of the occupation. People who want to convey, want to pretend that Hamas is the problem, it's very easy to say, well, Hamas did not exist until the late 80s, and before that, the occupation was still a fact on the ground. Palestinians were still denied their basic rights, and Israel was refusing to end the occupation. So just chronologically, it doesn't make any sense to say that Hamas is the problem. And the other obvious thing is that Hamas did not have a lot of popular support back when people believed that Israel was interested in allowing a real and viable Palestinian state to exist. When the peace negotiations were in the early phases in the early 90s, and people thought that Israel was serious about ending the occupation, support for groups like Hamas that were very militant and hardline and wanting to kind of like thwart any possibility of a peace process or peace with Israel, they enjoyed very little support. And it is only when it became clear that Israel is not interested in ending the occupation and that it will never allow Palestinians to have their rights, and was carrying on land theft left and right and settlement building. Once that dynamic became obvious, that's when Hamas's popularity rose significantly. And you can see it in Gaza. The situation of despair that Palestinians live in Gaza is the reason why Hamas is empowered. And frankly, if you want to disempower Hamas, if you want to defeat Hamas in some way, all you have to do is allow Palestinians an avenue towards freedom that does not require Hamas to intervene, and therefore there would be no reason for anyone to want to pick up a gun and fight. I mean, people just to be engaged in military conflict is not a pleasant experience. It's not what anybody wants for their families. When you look at the consequences of what's happening in Gaza, that is not what human beings want. But in the absence of freedom, they feel like there's no other choice left. And the problem is that Palestinians, every peaceful avenue towards freedom that they've tried, they've been shut down by Israel with US backing. They've tried negotiations. They were a sham. The US did not apply any pressure on Israel to negotiate in good faith. Israel made it clear that they were not negotiating in good faith. And so the peace process fell apart because instead of ending the occupation, Israel was entrenching the occupation while pretending to be negotiating for peace. And then Palestinians, engage in acts of boycott and call for a boycott solidarity movement across the world. Israel calls that economic terrorism. And then American politicians start passing laws to punish people who engage in boycotts of Israel in the United States, a violation of the First Amendment, by the way. And yet our politicians seem to be completely clueless when it comes to this, that you had, in the case of New York, when it was under Andrew Cuomo, he was openly calling for the boycott of other American states because of their policies on LGBTQ issues and all that. You might remember there were several controversies, including a boycott of Georgia because of, trying to pass anti-democratic measures at the polling stations. But yet, when it comes to boycotting Israel, Andrew Cuomo said that if you boycott Israel, then New York will boycott you. He's talking about isolating and punishing people in America for boycotting a foreign country over war crimes at the same time that he was saying boycotting American states was okay. So something does not add up here, and it does not make any sense. And look, on the question of Zionism, I personally try to avoid conversations about Zionism just because the word means, first of all, most Americans don't know what the word means. And then even among those who do, it means different things to different people. If you have somebody like Peter Beinart, who in my view is a really decent and moral human being, he describes himself as a Zionist, and yet he supports complete and total equality between Palestinians and Israelis. For me, that's not traditional Zionism in a way. It's not the dominant form of Zionism, and yet he uses the word to describe himself with it. Nonetheless, Zionism, as understood by Palestinians for good reason, the one that matters is not theoretical Zionism, or what does it mean, or does it just mean vaguely a Jewish homeland or not. Zionism, as it manifested itself politically on the ground, is the creation of Israel at the expense of Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed, who had their homes and towns and villages destroyed so that Israel can be built on top of them. That is what Zionism means to Palestinians as a direct experience. So I consider myself definitely an anti-Zionist, and I think that that's a correct position. That ought to be the position that people take. But nonetheless, I don't want to quibble over terminology and what it means. What is factual on the ground is the fact that Israel is an apartheid regime that treats Palestinians as lesser than. And as long as the Israeli regime treats Palestinians that way, they should not be supported by the United States as a moral issue, as a political issue, as a strategic issue. On every register, we have to end support for Israeli apartheid. And when we do, the Israeli government will see the incentive of changing behavior. We are the only country in the world that has leverage over them because of the amount of military funding and diplomatic protection that we give them. And we are in a position to alter their behavior. It is absolutely correct that Netanyahu is not individually the problem, because the entire political spectrum within Israel right now, the dominant political spectrum, is incredibly anti-Palestinian. And the trend in the United States is better than it is in Israel. They're going in opposite directions. In the US, there are promising signs that younger people are more progressive and aware and knowledgeable than older generations, and things are trending in a better direction. But in Israel, younger people are more right-wing and more anti-Palestinian. So the natural trajectory on the Israeli side is going in a very negative direction. So Israel is not going to correct course on its own in the foreseeable future. It requires US intervention. It requires us to end that unconditional support that Israel gets until Israel changes its behavior. And I think that is our ticket towards a better future, frankly, not just for Palestinians, but for Israelis too, for people who just care about Israelis for whatever reason. If you want a future for them in which they're not constantly in conflict, it is a future in which they have to recognize Palestinians as equal human beings with equal rights. And once that is achieved, that is a better future for everyone, including Americans, Palestinians, and Israelis.
Omar Baddar, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sabrina. Appreciate it.